Good morning, everyone, those at home and those here. Today I'm going to talk about the eighth of the eight awarenesses of a enlightened person. I've been talking about the first seven over the last couple months. And just to reiterate, the first one is having few desires. And then the second one is knowing how to be satisfied. And the third one is enjoying serenity and tranquility. The fourth was exerting meticulous effort. And the fifth was not forgetting right thoughts. Sixth, practicing Samadhi. The seventh, cultivating wisdom. And this eighth one is called avoiding idle talk. And about this eighth awareness, Dogen said, having realization and being free from discrimination is what is called avoiding idle talk. To totally know the true form of all things is the same as being without idle talk. So it's not just fantasizing or gossiping. He's saying that to totally know the true form of all things, that's what avoiding idle talk is. So Dogen's a little esoteric compared to the title. But the Buddha was a little more down to earth. He says, when you monks engage in various kinds of idle talk, your minds are disturbed. Although you have left home and become monks, you are still not liberated. Therefore, you monks must quickly abandon mind-disturbing idle talk. If you'd like to attain the joy of the extinction of delusion, you must first simply extinguish the affliction of idle talk. This is what is called avoiding idle talk. And of course, the Buddha was talking to monks, but he could be talking to anybody, to avoid idle talk. Thus, avoiding idle talk is the fruit of our practice and is identical with our wisdom. Only after overcoming the gap between ourselves and others can we really avoid idle talk. So how can we overcome the gaps in our life? Well, first of all, attention. As one Zen master said, after he was asked, what's the secret of practice? He said, attention. And he said, what else? And he said, attention, attention. So attention to how we use our energy. Zazen and no unnecessary talking, not only during session. So most idle talk is ego-centered, puffing us up or putting us down. So even thinking can be idle talk, especially during session. So to clarify who we really are, we can't do it through discursive thought or words. We must do it in actual practice with the whole body. During session, when you're focusing your concentration on your breath or on your koan, your mind begins to become quiet. When you break your silence and talk unnecessarily, it's like hitting a large bell which resonates for a long time. So in a similar way, your mind reverberates with the conversation and does not quiet down right away. Your mind massages and manipulates the conversation ad nauseum, especially if it affects your ego or your self-image. I'm sure you've all experienced that, you know? Not necessarily during session, but when you've had a conversation that you run over in your mind 1,000 times. I should have said, they shouldn't have said, and so forth. In the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha tells the story of a man who was shot with a poisonous arrow. And the man was kind of intellectual and started analyzing the situation, wondering who shot the arrow and why, and from what kind of tree was the shaft of the arrow made, and what poison was the arrowhead tipped with. And he'll die before he answers a fraction of the questions. The Buddha said he immediately needs to pull out the arrow and avoid idle talk. So put yourself into your zazen and avoid idle talk. We spend so much time judging, evaluating, and being anxious about all kinds of things. So, but if we look at it carefully, it's being anxious about being anxious, like putting a head on top of our head. What do you need another head for? You have a beautiful head right now. So when we consider our bodhisattva precepts that we received during Jukai, 3 of the 10 grave precepts are about speech or talk. They include number 4, which says, do not lie, and number 6, which says, do not speak of others' errors and faults, and number 7, which says, do not elevate yourself and put down others. In a Buddhist wedding ceremony, the couple has some general vows which they recite, and one of them is, I will speak what I believe to be the truth. So what is the truth? Maybe some of you have seen that classic Japanese movie, Rashomon, directed by Kurosawa. Have any of you seen that? Yeah. If you recall, I think it was 4 different characters who narrated their versions of the same event that they all witnessed. And of course, their eyewitness accounts were wildly different. So what is the truth? I saw a movie clip on the internet where the participants were asked to count how many times the characters on the screen passed a ball between them. And there are about 8 people passing this ball. And during the part of the movie, a person dressed in a gorilla suit walks across the set. And most people can count the number of times the ball was passed, but they didn't even see the gorilla. It's called the invisible gorilla experiment. And it shows that when we're focused on one thing, we fail to notice other important events or things. Has a part as a bag lady in her Broadway play called The Search for Intelligent Life in the Universe, Lily Tomlin had this line, reality is a collective hunch. Yeah, as most of you know, I was trained as a scientist at a fairly high level. And one thing I learned actually is reading science philosophy is not so far off the mark. That scientific facts actually are those scientists who have the most power decide are scientific facts. I mean, it's not, something like if you drop an object, it'll fall down, but explaining, what the theory is as to why it falls down. But this there's this invisible gorilla experiment where they didn't see the gorilla, but there are examples in science of experiments that failed what they were originally looking for, and the fact that it failed changed the direction of the field. And probably one of the most famous ones in physics is called the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887. And it was to show that the speed of light was dependent upon the motion of the Earth. And at that time, most of physics was based on Newton's discoveries. And it was believed that there was a fixed reference frame in the universe. They call it the luminiferous ether, and everything moved relative to it. So, it's like when you move relative to something else, you're moving faster than either one of you are moving. At least the distance between you is closing faster than either one of you is moving. And so they set up this experiment to look at the speed of light going parallel to the motion of the Earth and perpendicular, so that they would be able to distinguish the motion of the Earth through the ether. And the experiment showed that the speed of light was independent of the motion of the Earth, so they were setting out to prove that there was an ether, and what they ended up proving, there was no ether. And that observation actually was the foundation of Einstein's theories of relativity about 20 years later. So it's interesting when we don't see things that we expect to see. Sometimes the discovery will even be greater than actually seeing things we expect to see. And the actual title of this awareness is, according to my teacher Maizumi Roshi, is Fu Keiron, and he translated it as avoiding idle talk. And Fu means negation or negative, and Kei means to play with, and Non means talk. So it says, don't play around with your talk, would be one way to translate it. So don't obsess over your talk. Don't take pride in your talk. Just avoid idle talk. So it's interesting that after enumerating all kinds of sophisticated principles in the previous 7 awarenesses of the enlightened person, the Buddha ends with something as basic as this: do not play around with your speech. Don't expound fantasies. Do not daydream. So as long as we talk about things as if they're outside ourselves, we're engaging in idle talk. So the 6th precept is to not speak of others' errors and faults. So how do we correct people without making them wrong? See, some of you are parents. How do you correct your kids without making them feel guilty or shameful? So our egotistical, discriminating mind looks for faults in others. The heart sees everything with compassion. The heart sees the heart in others. When you see human beings from the heart, you'll recognize others as your own self. So the following story, which I'm going to narrate, Roshi Shinko and I included in our book, The Great Heart Way. And it was written by Tenko Nishida, who is the founder of a Buddhist service community, Itoen, in Japan in the last century. And he wrote, When my son was 13, he dearly liked playing cards and became quite skillful. During the winter vacation, he would go around the neighborhood and sometimes not return home until morning. My former wife was very worried and said to me, "He comes back late every night and takes no notice of my scolding. Will you please take him in hand and admonish him?" I replied, "Some time ago I might have done this, but I cannot do it now." And she protested, "But if we leave him to his own devices, he will be ruined. I am desperately anxious." "I'm anxious too," I said, "but I don't know what to do, because I cannot correct even my own errors. For all I know, he also may be trying to reform himself. If I am not ashamed of my own wrongdoings, I might find fault with our son. But as it is, I simply cannot do this. I must first rid myself of my own flaws. I am in a very embarrassing position." My wife was not satisfied, but the only conclusion I came to was that before I could reprove others, I must first become perfect myself. However, I could not help but be concerned about my son's bad habits. Then one day it happened that he came to me with a book and asked me to explain a certain passage, as he was going to give a talk to some children in the neighborhood. I asked him to sit down. I told him how his mother had said, what his mother had said, that I should reprove him for his bad habits he had formed. I went on, "I cannot do as she asked because I am unable to change my own bad habits. Although I admit that if I had to wait until I am perfect myself, then there is every reason to be very anxious about your future. I am not qualified to educate you. I'm very sorry about this, but it cannot be helped." My son remained silent, but his face was sour. I continued, "If you were to say to me, 'Please point out my faults, even though you have faults yourself,' then I should do as you asked, to the very best of my ability. If, however, you thought it unreasonable that I should reprove you because I have my own faults, I would not do so. But I should then ask you not to call me father anymore." As I spoke, I unconsciously put my hands on the floor to bow before him. My son seemed to be very annoyed, although he said nothing. Perhaps he had pierced my state of mind, which may have seemed strange, but was also tender. The next moment, he got up suddenly and ran away. And I said to myself, he's only a child after all. The next morning, I found a letter on my desk addressed to me, but bearing no signature. It read, "Please pardon me and tell me about my faults, even though you have many of your own, and please let me call you father." Tears came to my eyes. I called my wife and said, "Read this." She said he was sobbing in his bed last night and seemed to be writing something. I suppose it was this. "Since that time, although I have never spoken to my son in a voice demanding obedience, he has never disobeyed me. But I noticed that he was not so obedient to his mother. The difference arose because I prayed that light would show me my faults, but my wife did not. There is a vast difference between these attitudes. The first seeks to have one's child brought up by light. The second tries to accomplish this by human power. Most parents think that there is no other way than to scold a child. No religious teacher or educationalist ever suggests the possibility of a parent frankly acknowledging to his child their own errors. But a new awareness led me to practice this. Since Tenko-san practiced from the heart, he was in touch with the depth of his feelings and was able to help his son. His wife did not and was not able to reach their son. In the process of spiritual transformation, it's crucial that we treat our inner perpetrator or our faults with compassion. So a saint, a devil, a victim, and a perpetrator are just one mind. Zen Master Bernie Glassman, one of my mentors, started bearing witness meditation retreats at Auschwitz, Nazi Germany's largest concentration and extermination camp. There they focused on healing the suffering of both the victims and the perpetrators. Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." We do share the same mind of the worst criminals because essentially there's only one mind. As psychologist Stanislav Grof wrote, "I see clearly that humanity's problem is not the existence of vicious dictators, but the hidden killer that we all harbor within our own psyches, if we look deep enough." Malignant aggression does not reflect true human nature. It's connected with a domain of unconscious dynamics that separate us from our deeper identity. There's no doubt that malignant aggression is connected with traumas and frustrations in childhood and infancy. So when we accept and heal the perpetrator within, we can do much to help others, because we can emanate to them the same understanding and compassion we have been able to extend to ourselves. In Matthew chapter 21, verse 31, Jesus said to those who are argumentative and lack faith, "Verily I say to you, that even publicans and harlots will enter the kingdom of heaven before you." Is he finding fault? Or is he using his words to encourage them to look within? So the seventh grave precept is, don't elevate yourself and blame others. And one of the reasons we violate this precept is that we come from a position of scarcity. As children, we thought there was not enough love for us. So if our parents showed affection to our siblings or even to each other, we would feel that we're being denied. Or if we wanted more food or sweets than we got, we were being denied. And we blamed our siblings or house guests for taking food from our mouths. Or if we felt deprived of toys or vacations. At work, when your department has a fixed amount of money for raises, if someone gets more than the average, you have to get less than the average. Especially in our country, We never know who came in second. We only adore winners. In the Great Heart Way, violations of this precept are called crossing the mind streams. It's when we get pleasure from the pain of others. It's when we feel good, when we can lord ourselves over others. Why would we elevate ourselves and blame others if it did not feel good? And what is it that feels good? Is it the true self? Is it the heart, or is it the self-grasping ego? One of the Dharma seals or basic teachings of the Buddha is that there is no fixed thing such as the ego, such as the self. So what is it that's feeling good? If we can manage to see the emptiness of the self, then how would we act? As one interpretation of this precept says, realize self and others as one. If we realize self and others as one, how would we behave? When I was doing research in the university, one of my professors had this quote on his wall. There's no limit to what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Like so much of our practice, it's easy to say, but difficult to do. In the Platform Sutra, attributed to the sixth patriarch, it's written, if you condemn the world, that is your own condemnation. By criticizing others, you're criticizing yourself. You're opening your mouth wide and exposing the nature of your own guts. There's a funny story that could be told about any religion, but let's place it in a church where the visiting cardinal kneels before the altar and prays out loud, my Heavenly Father, although I am unworthy of your love, please bless me with your guidance. Then the parish priest enters and prays out loud, my Heavenly Father, although I am unworthy of your love, please bless me with your guidance. And the janitor who was standing in the back of the sanctuary comes forward and prays out loud, O Heavenly Father, although I am unworthy of your love, please bless me with guidance. Then the priest turns to the cardinal and says, Look who thinks he's unworthy. Even humility can be a competitive sport. There's a Yiddish proverb that says, too humble is half proud. And Roshi Shinko told me that she once heard Kaplo Roshi say to a student, don't be so humble, you're not that great. So not elevating ourselves includes accepting slander and criticism. There's a famous story about Master Haku, which I'm sure many of you know, but I'll repeat it because it's apropos to this talk. Zen Master Hakuin lived in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. He created the famous koan, What's the Sound of One Hand? And he believed that the understanding arising out of practice in everyday life was deeper than the understanding that could come from practicing in the monastery. Since lay people face more distractions, hold more responsibilities, and experience more heartbreak than the monks, and so need to practice with great diligence. And he was respected and had many disciples. At one time in his life, he lived in a village hermitage close to a food shop run by a couple and their beautiful young daughter. And one day, the parents discovered that their daughter was pregnant. Angry and distraught, they demanded to know the name of the father. At first, the girl refused to confess. But after much harassment, she named Hakuin, the Zen master. The furious parents confronted Hakuin, berating him in front of all of his students, and he simply replied, "Is that so?" When the baby was born, the family gave it to Hakuin. By this time, he had lost his reputation and his disciples. But Hakuin was not disturbed. He took delight in caring for the infant child. He was able to obtain milk and other essentials from the villagers. A year later, the young mother of the child was troubled by great remorse. She confessed the truth to her parents. The real father was not Hakuin, but rather a young man who had worked at the local fish market. The mortified parents went to Hakuin apologizing, asking for his forgiveness for the wrong they did him. They asked Hakuin to return the baby. Although he loved the child as his own, Hakuin was willing to give him up without a complaint. And all he said, "Is that so?" I was struck by this story and don't think I could act similarly to Hakuin if it were me accused. But the truth I have learned is we can never know how things are going to turn out. We don't know what happened to that child. It's probably raised very lovingly after Hakuin treated him with such care. In the year 1967, after I received my PhD in physics, I was offered a fellowship to do research in England. I was married to my first wife, Marcia, at the time, and we went to England together. When my fellowship ended, I was offered another fellowship to do research in Paris, and I was eager to go. But Marcia was tired of trailing around after me and got so sick that we could not relocate. We were in London, and I had no income, and she was sick. I could have blamed her for messing up my plans. I eventually got a job as a science writer and editor for New Scientist magazine. And during that time, Sochu Suzuki Roshi arrived in London as a guest of the Buddhist Society. I started sitting with Sochu Roshi and became quite close to him. And my relationship with him propelled me on the path of the Buddha. If I had gone to Paris, I never would have met him. So now I can thank my wife for foiling my plans. After 3 years of studying with Sochu Roshi, I returned to California and connected with Maizumi Roshi, whose Dharma I succeeded. Maizumi Roshi knew Sochu Roshi and saw him on occasion in Japan. And it warmed my heart to learn that Sochu Roshi always asked about Wick-san. It's interesting that the Buddha avoided talking about certain subjects because they're speculative and constitute idle talk. And one of the subjects he never talked about or discussed was if there's life after death. These are matters that it's no use arguing over. Although, as we know, other religions have eternal life in heaven or hell, or reincarnation where you can try again. You know, you know what a mulligan is in golf? Yeah. But whenever he was asked about what happened in death, after life, he was always silent. You know. But then I learned from reading scholarly books that I think it was Robert Thurman, who was a Buddhist scholar from Columbia University. He said that if you don't believe in reincarnation, you're not a true Buddhist. Well, please, Robert Thurman, accept my faults. I mean, if I experienced it, then I'd believe it. And I actually asked a number of Zen masters about reincarnation. I asked Sochi Roshi, and he said, could be. And then I asked Ada Roshi, and he said something similar. He said, it's better to say could be than to say no. And when I asked Maizumi Roshi, he said no. But then I heard him tell other people yes. So we can discuss it as long as we want. But the Buddha considered it to be idle talk. But ultimately, everything that comes from outside us, from someone or someplace else, through reading, through hearing, or through seeing, will be a kind of idle talk, unless we really understand the very nature of our own being, our own life. So often when students progress through their practice here, and I want them to start giving talks and instruction to others, I always tell them, don't speculate, only come from your own experience. What is your experience? Or it's okay to say the Buddha said this, or the sixth patriarch said that. But if it's not your own experience, then it's speculation. So if we really see clearly the nature of our own life, we will then understand that everyone else and everything else is Buddha nature itself. And that's how to avoid idle talk. And I'll reread it again, what Dogen said, because it gets right to the point. Having realization and being free from discrimination is what is called avoiding idle talk. To totally know the true form of all things is the same as being without idle talk. So this session is already half over. So please take full advantage of the time here. Avoid idle talk. Really put yourself into your practice. Thank you.